At the time of this recording, only a few hours remain before Elon Musk makes his speech to the world as to how things are going to go for spaceflight, at least as far as Starship is concerned, for the next 20 years. This is, of course, very exciting to myself and probably just about everybody watching this video. However, I think it's also important to talk about the last 20 years of spaceflight and what is likely to be happening. As most of us have probably heard, NASA plans to re-enter the space station and destroy it by 2030 or so. And this has come as a shock and an outrage to quite a number of people, to a degree myself as well. Obviously, people are very upset over the fact that something that has required such a huge investment in technology and innovation, and most of all money, is going to be simply disposed of in a decade or so. I mean, given all of the scientific discoveries that have been made on the ISS, given all of the incredible history that has been made on this space station, is getting rid of it, just destroying it without any other possible use, really the only option that NASA has? Could they perhaps sell it? Could they lease it out to commercial agencies? Is there any other option besides simply destroying the most expensive piece of equipment that the human race has ever built, and with a great deal of difficulty as well? I mean, think about it for a moment. The ISS represents the culmination of the US space program ever since the early 1970s. The space shuttle was designed to deploy a space station. Granted, it was Space Station Freedom in those days, but that was the whole idea of the space shuttle. So this kind of makes all of the sacrifices that were made on Challenger and Columbia a bit meaningless if we get rid of what they had worked so hard to assemble. And granted, it may have started in the 1990s, well after the shuttle program got started, but still, it's the culmination of their efforts. What the hell are we doing? Isn't there a better way? Well, NASA recently released a document called the International Space Station Transition Report that argues that there is no better way, that the longer we keep the ISS in operation, the more of NASA's resources have to be invested in it, and the less we're going to get out of it, that re-entering the ISS and destroying it is really the only option that we have, at least as far as affordable options go. Yes, we could keep it plugging along in some shape or form, but the longer we do that, the more money it's going to cost, and the more remote NASA's future plans, especially going to Mars, becomes. But is this really the case? Well, let's have a look at this plan and see. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well, so it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry! And incidentally, if I could make an appeal right now, please follow me on Twitter, and also if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please consider doing so. Once again, I've noticed that I have over 150,000 consistent viewers, and if only 2/3 of them were to subscribe, I would hit 100,000 subscribers and propel this channel into a completely new place. But enough of my salesmanship, let's move on to the topic at hand. When you look at this report, at least least as far as the introduction is concerned, it would seem that getting rid of the ISS is the last damn thing we should be doing. Quote, "Today, with commercial crew and cargo transportation systems online, the ISS is busier than ever. The ISS-NL, responsible for utilizing 50% of NASA's resources aboard the ISS, hosts hundreds of experiments from other government agencies and commercial users to return benefits to people and industry on the ground. Meanwhile, NASA's research and development activities aboard are advancing the technologies and procedures that will be necessary to send the first woman and first person of color to the moon and the first humans to Mars. The ISS is entering an era of robust commercial use, taking advantage of the utilities provided by the ISS to develop the capabilities industry needs to move from being dependent on NASA for space station utilization to providing the platforms the agency will need to continue its mission in LEO after the lifetime of the ISS. So herein lies the point. NASA feels that the ISS is at the end of this transitional period, that commercial agencies that want to take advantage of experiments and manufacturing that they can do in microgravity are going to have to rely on commercial space stations rather than expensive governmental ones, and the government is going to move on to bigger and better things. As a matter of fact, the extreme expense involved in keeping the ISS operational is making it almost impossible for us to go back to the moon, let alone even think about going to Mars, or so the argument goes. So one of NASA's plans is to lease commercial space aboard new commercial space stations at a much lower price than maintaining the ISS in order to accomplish the same scientific work that they've been doing in the past. And nothing demonstrates this gradual transition better than the Axiom space plan. Axiom Hub 1, which will be added in less than 2 years, includes crew quarters, research and manufacturing done for private industry, but also something that could theoretically be used by NASA and other governmental space agencies as well. This station will be gradually built off of the ISS, utilizing the ISS's life support systems and other habitable space in order to support its operations until it's ready to become a free-flying station on its own. And once it does become a free-flying station, we will be closer to being ready to re-enter the ISS and dispose of it, or again, so the plan goes. Axiom Hub 2 that you're watching being added by a Canadarm. Oh, by the way, Axiom Space's station will also have its own Canadarm. This is expanded crew quarters and research capacity. Ultimately, the Axiom station will be able to carry 8 crew members. It's actually a pretty ambitious station. Then after that, you have the third module, which is the Axiom Lab, a state-of-the-art research and manufacturing facility, and some of you may have heard this description in the past. I have done some other videos about this particular station, but it has been some time. And then after that, you have what's called the Axiom Power Tower, which you're going to see deployed here in just a moment, and it has expanded environmental, life support, storage, and payload capabilities. Now, one thing that I really like about the Power Tower is the fact that it generates so much energy with far less space, with far less square footage of solar panels, shall we say. It's utilizing a bleeding edge solar technology in order to generate about as much power as the entire ISS, which is quite impressive. Also, you may have noticed that a module was added to the bottom of the station. This is what I like to call the microgravity hot tub, and this is an environment that will provide a 360-degree panorama to astronauts on board, giving them an unprecedented view of space and also of our home planet rotating beneath them. Quite an amazing thing. And this station, as I said before, will be free-flying once complete, and it's also had a new module added since the last video that I did about it, and that's an inflatable module, as you can see here, that will be used by film crews in the future. who may be interested in filming microgravity action scenes, those sorts of things. Plus, honestly, it would provide a very entertaining microgravity environment for space tourists visiting the station as well. So this is a station that will serve both scientific and commercial and space tourism purposes. Very ambitious and not the only commercial space station that's planned. But what about the ISS? Why does that have to be disposed of even with these new stations going up? Doesn't it still represent a colossal waste? Well, in my opinion, it really does. Even if it does require an insane amount of money to keep this going, even though as the station ages, the astronauts on board are going to be spending more and more of their time maintaining it as opposed to doing science, it seems to me there needs to be a better option. But before we explore that, let's have a look at some of the numbers that NASA has put together in terms of how much they're going to save by getting rid of the ISS once they do have a replacement. So, like most governmental programs, we have a graph. Let's have a look at this. First of all, you have the orange section, which is the ISS expense. Everything that goes on the ISS is represented by that shade. Then you have the dark blue, not the really dark blue, but the very large section of blue, which is space transportation. This is crew and cargo transportation to and from the ISS, because keep in mind, commercial space stations are going to be providing their own transportation, or at least that's the assumption. Then you also have ISS decommissioning and retirement, which is that small dark blue section, and then ISS deorbit. Both of those are very small costs, not really much to be considered compared to the rest of it. Then you have the yellow section, which is the cost, the commercial LEO destination services rather, that NASA is going to be using to contract commercial entities to keep their programs going, to keep their scientific work going. So here's the argument. If you can keep everything that NASA is currently doing on the ISS operational on commercial stations, plus NASA no longer has to pay for much when we're talking about space transportation, you save a hell of a lot of money. $1.3 billion in 2031, ramping up to $1.8 billion by 2033. So if you're talking about a 10-year program, you would have an extra $18 billion to spend on it. And if you consider that the ridiculously overpriced SLS has cost a little north of $20 billion, saving $18 billion over the course of 10 years could really make a massive difference if you want to go to Mars. And herein lies NASA's long-term objectives, going to Mars as well as maintaining a permanent presence on the moon. And their plan kind of addresses all of this when we're talking about the ISS through 2030, for example. Quote, use ISS as an analog to address the operational challenges and hazards of human spaceflight for long-duration missions, including extensive communication delays, distance from Earth, and gravity changes. And then after the ISS is gone, you purchase exploration technology testbed and analog services, such as the testing of life support, medical, food production, and exercise equipment on a CLD, which is a private space station. You then purchase private astronaut time on or rent space on CLD facilities to continue risk reduction activities best suited for an LEO platform, including NASA astronauts and or purchasing private astronaut data as available. You purchase time on CLD facilities to build NASA astronaut flight experience and employ CLDs as a proving ground to test and validate biological and physical science experiments and technology prior to lunar and Mars missions. So you continue using these commercial space stations to do what you've been doing on the ISS all along, which is getting ready to go to Mars. And at the same time, all of the things that you've been doing on the ISS can still be carried out on these commercial stations. So it's a win-win in NASA's mind. You save $1.8 billion a year, you continue everything you've always been doing on the ISS, and you have enough spare cash to ultimately go to Mars. And a great number of the ongoing experiments taking place on the ISS that will be taking place on commercial space stations as well are specifically oriented towards long-duration journeys to other planets, such as space radiation exposure, spaceflight-induced cardiovascular diseases, cognitive or behavioral conditions, and the impact that spaceflight has on those things, inadequate food and nutrition, what might that do to somebody in spaceflight, spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. You may have seen some stories about the fact that people who stay in microgravity for a long period of time start to lose their eyesight. Also, human systems integration architecture, medications, long-term storage, in-flight medical conditions, things that really haven't come up on ISS flights but might come up on a 3-year journey to Mars, injury from dynamic loads, injury due to EVA operations, all sorts of experiments that are ongoing on the ISS that will continue at a lower cost on commercial space stations as we prepare for a journey to Mars. And how will this journey look? Well, unless NASA plans on using Starship, and perhaps they intend to, it's going to be a very, very expensive endeavor indeed. My favorite non-Starship vessel for going to Mars, and yes, this comes in a distant second because of the extreme expense involved, is the Lockheed Martin Mars Base Camp. This is based off of the Orion spacecraft, and you may notice it being part of the structure of this vessel, which provides command and control throughout the entire mission and a re-entry vehicle for when it comes back to Earth. On top of that, it has crew quarters, which is largely based on ISS modules, providing crew living space and life support systems. It also has a tank farm, obviously providing propellant storage, habitats and laboratories, also solar arrays for power generation, a central node, and an excursion module, but not for going to Mars, rather for going to Phobos and Deimos, including an airlock and small landing legs, cryogenic propulsion stages providing high thrust in-space propulsion, solar electric propulsion stages as well. And I am a big fan of this feature because it provides engines that have a much larger, or rather longer, ISP than traditional chemical engines, therefore shortening the transition time from Earth to Mars and giving the vessel a lot more fuel for maneuvering in case of unexpected circumstances. So really, I like lots of things about this vessel. However, of course, there are lots of things I don't like. For example, the Orion is an incredibly expensive vehicle on its own, and in order to build something like this, you would have to build it in low Earth orbit or perhaps in lunar orbit, piece by piece. Now, you might be able to build it utilizing something like Falcon Heavy or perhaps the Vulcan Centaur, something along those lines, but all of this is going to be massively expensive. So once again, saving $18 billion over 10 years is probably going to be a good thing if this turns out to be the option that NASA uses for going to Mars. And another feature that I really like, as you're seeing right now, is the Phobos Explorer. The whole idea of exploring and perhaps utilizing this moon as a base of operations to explore Mars as a source of fuel and other resources, I think that Phobos is something that has been woefully underestimated. And as you can see here, it also has a Mars glider built into the concept, and also a lander that has yet to be fully fleshed out, something of course that would have to be included as well. But let's face it, NASA is going to have a lot of time to flesh out this lander, given the fact that they are not going to really be getting started on this program in earnest until the ISS gets deorbited. The ISS is going to cost entirely too much money until 2030, especially if we're doing Artemis at the same time, for us to seriously invest in something like this. Now, there are certain aspects of the Mars base camp that I'm a bit big fan of. The fact that you don't have to have what I call the Starship suicide dive, trying to set down 100 tons worth of Starship plus 100 tons worth of cargo, utilizing the extremely thin Martian atmosphere, and somehow setting down safely on the surface of the planet. I continue to argue that that is going to be a very difficult thing to undertake. So something that orbits Mars and has a small lander that can be set down utilizing perhaps an inflatable heat shield, that is a lot more feasible in my opinion. However, as I said before, this is going to be far more expensive. But on the plus side, it's something that may be able to use nuclear thermal engines as well. You could easily swap out the cryo stage for a nuclear thermal engine and then have the tank farm loaded up with liquid hydrogen propellant. You wouldn't need an oxidizer at all, and then have the solar electric engines for when you need maneuvers that require a little more finesse. This is just a few ideas for the base camp, but once again, the base camp is going to be so prohibitively costly that even saving $18 billion from 2030 until 2040 may not be enough to build something like this and send it to Mars by 2040. And by the way, we're talking 20 years from now, far less ambitious than what Elon Musk is looking at. So here's hoping that whatever he has to talk about in the next few hours is going to be far more ambitious and encouraging than trying to use this thing sometime in 2040. But to get back to the original concept, does the ISS really need to be deorbited? In my opinion, no. You can accomplish everything that NASA wants to accomplish without destroying the ISS. Put the damn thing up for sale. There's got to be some kind of commercial entity that can make use of this, repurpose it, refurbish it, whatever, or just bring it down to put some part of it in a museum. Don't just burn up all of this time, all of this innovation, all of this investment in one fiery moment in 2031. I think that that is ridiculously wasteful, and even though an ISS re-entry would probably look far more spectacular than these few Starlink satellites that were forced to re-enter after getting hit by a massive solar storm, don't underestimate the power of the sun, guys, but that's a topic for another video. There's just better options that need to be explored before we undertake this radical solution. The ISS has too much history, too much time invested in it, too much money, and too many things have been accomplished by this amazing structure, this amazingly expensive structure, to simply destroy it. There are better alternatives that need to be thoroughly investigated before we finally go for this kind of solution. If you like what I have to say, please check out the description. There are many ways to support my channel to keep this content going. So until NASA gets a little bit more inventive, starts thinking outside the box for the future of the ISS, so we don't have to undertake such a destructive and wasteful alternative, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.